Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today at our pre-conference TESS 2024 pre-conference webinar. We'll just give folks a moment to get into the room, virtual room as it were. Hopefully everybody's having a lovely day. And I'll put a welcome in the chat. Bonjour Taylor, comment ça va? And yes, happy Halloween. Let's give folks one more minute. Elvis literally left my building earlier today when I was leaving the elevator. I saw Elvis walk out. Then I remembered it was Halloween. Hello, Elspeth. Great to see you here. I'll see you in the chat. Exactly, Joel. I'm very happy that everybody's here. Okay, it's 2 minutes past. So we're going to get started. I'm Robert Luke. I'm the CEO of eCampus Ontario, and I'm really pleased to be hosting today's webinar, TESS 2024 pre-conference webinar, specifically on some really groundbreaking research that has been undertaken by some folks here in the sector who I will introduce in just a moment. I'm just going to start by providing a land acknowledgement. And it's important for us to always acknowledge the land on which we are living to ensure that not only do we meet our obligations under the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action, but also to ensure that we maintain our commitment to reconciliation and decolonization. So eCampus Ontario acknowledges that the land we are meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. It's now home, of course, to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people, and indeed people from around the world. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. I would encourage you, if you're so inclined, to you can use the link that Jason has put there, native-land.ca, to see where you're located and understand the traditional territories from which you are coming from. So I'm very pleased to be convening this discussion today and introducing 3 colleagues who are doing such amazing work on open educational practices. I'll start by introducing Dr. Rajiv Janjiani, who's the Vice Provost Teaching and Learning and Director of the Inclusive Education Research Lab at Brock University, where he holds faculty appointments in the Departments of Educational Studies and Psychology, and is affiliated with the Social Justice Research Institute and the Social Justice and Equity Studies MA program. Rajiv, welcome. I'm pleased also to introduce you to Oya Pakao, who is a PhD student in Brock University's Psychology Department and a graduate student member of the Inclusive Education Research Lab. And last but certainly not least, our colleague Catherine Lachine, who is the Open Education Librarian at the University of Ottawa Library, where she's been working since 2016. She also works as the Scientific Coordinator of the University of Ottawa's Research Chair on Digital Thriving in Franco-Ontarian Communities. So welcome to you all. I would just say on a personal note, I've been super pleased to be supporting and learning from these folks over the last while on this research project. And I'm so excited to be here to hear what they have to say on the work that they're doing, as you can see here, called On a Path to Open, a report on the capacity of Ontario's post-secondary education institutions to support open educational practices. Open education is a significant priority for the sector. It's a significant priority for eCampus Ontario. And I'm very grateful for Rajiv's leadership here in the sector to support a more in-depth understanding of how we can get more people to adopt open educational resources and open educational practices more generally. I'm very pleased also to tell you that this project that Rajiv is reporting on was supported by an Insight Development Grant from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, And maybe most importantly, I'm not sure, but the actual report will be released on November the 5th at the Technology and Education Seminar and Showcase. If you don't have your tickets yet, contact me. I can connect you. On November the 5th, as I said, Rajiv and Oya and Catherine are going to be giving a presentation similar to this on the report, and we will even be distributing some hard copies and getting this out far and wide. Having seen an earlier version of it, I can tell you that the report is fantastic, and you're going to enjoy today's discussion. So without further ado, Steve, over to you.
Thank you so very much, Robert, for that very kind introduction and those kind words. And of course, it's been an absolute delight to partner with the Campus Ontario, as well, of course, with Catherine and Oya in this space. We are in many ways building on the work and standing on the shoulders of incredible colleagues, not just across the province, but across the country who've been working hard to advance open education over the last decade and more. So thanks very much for this opportunity. I also want to wish everybody not just a happy Halloween, but a very, very happy Diwali as well for those of you who celebrate. I'm grateful to be joining you today from Brock University, which is located in the traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples, many of whom continue to live and work here today. The territory here in Niagara is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties and is within the land protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. As Robert mentioned, I'm really pleased to be joined as well by our colleagues and research collaborators over here. And so we're going to begin today by providing a brief overview of open education in the Canadian context before describing the development of the institutional self-assessment tool that was used in this project. We will then take you through a quick summary of the results of our study of Ontario's colleges, universities, and Indigenous institutes before closing with a set of recommendations for the sector. We will certainly have time at the end as well to address your questions. So to begin, and briefly, I'll note that open education is a philosophy about the way in which people produce, share, and build on knowledge. Proponents of open education believe that everyone in the world should have access to high-quality educational experiences and resources, and we work together to eliminate barriers to this goal, whether these are high monetary costs, outdated or obsolete materials, or even legal mechanisms that prevent or inhibit collaboration among scholars and educators. Open educational practices often center on the use of open educational resources, or OER, which are, of course, learning, teaching, and research materials available in various formats that are either in the public domain or released under an open Creative Commons license that permit no-cost access, reuse, repurpose, adaptation, and redistribution by others. But open educational practices also encompasses the embrace of open pedagogy. These are collaborative teaching practices that may draw on OER, but that also invite students to co-create the learning experience. This may, for example, include students creating OER as part of their coursework via the design of renewable assignments that have a larger audience, a longer life, and a greater impact than traditional disposable assignments. And finally, open education may be better understood as an important part of a broader spectrum of open movements that share similar values and sometimes similar tools, including those related to open access scholarship, open data, and open science practices.
Open educational practices come with a lot of educational benefits. One of the primary advantages is the significant reduction in the financial burden that commercial textbooks impose on students. And this is especially crucial for students from disadvantaged backgrounds who might struggle to afford traditional textbooks. In terms of educational outcomes, research indicates that students who use OER perform equally well, if not better, than their peers who use traditional textbooks. In terms of engagement, early studies show that OER not only helps with cost savings, but also fosters higher level of student motivation and engagement. Faculty also report positive changes in classroom dynamics when using OER, where notable outcomes include improved quality of student work and stronger relationships between students and instructors.
So for over 10 years at this point, Canada has been a global leader in OER usage. And this certainly began in British Columbia, where the BC Open Textbook Project was launched in 2012 with support from the Ministry of Advanced Education. More than a decade later, the BC Open Collection hosts 350 open textbooks and almost 850 other course materials that have been adopted across 43 institutions by over 1,000 faculty members, saving students in BC nearly $40 million. And then that includes, of course, OER adoptions at institutions such as Kwantlen Polytechnic University that have developed numerous zero textbook cost or ZTC degree programs. As Robert mentioned, Ontario has also made significant investments in OER development, notably through the virtual learning strategy. OER use in Ontario is quite significant. 98% of eCampus Ontario's 53 member institutions report OER adoption by over 18,000 faculty and staff across the province. This generates significant savings for learners, about $26.5 million and counting, although that number is likely a conservative estimate. The eCampus Ontario Open Library currently houses over 1,800 resources and over 7,000 shareable activities in its H5P studio, and 30 out of 53 members have federated the Open Library into their library systems. The reach of this Open Library is global, with nearly every country at this point reporting adoptions. And beyond BC and Ontario, there have been coalitions of post-secondary institutions, educators, librarians, and students that have worked to raise awareness and develop supports, engage in advocacy for OER across the country, including through regional initiatives such as Atlantic OER and the Alberta OER Community of Practice, as well as national organizations such as the Canadian Association of Research Libraries and the Canadian Alliance of Student Associations. In 2023, OER practitioners and advocates from across the country formed the OER National Strategy Group, which then developed a national advocacy framework for OER in Canada. This framework recognizes Canada's responsibility to uphold the 2012 as well as the 2019 UNESCO commitments to OER by playing an active role in the sustainable global production of freely available educational materials. And in doing so, it specifically highlights the importance of promotion, infrastructure development, and capacity building for quality OER in both English and in French.
As a leader in open education, Canada's bilingual status places it in a unique position to support the creation, adaptation, and adoption of OER in French. Although there are OER in French from Francophone countries such as France, OER that have real pedagogical impact must represent the distinctive cultures and languages of Canadians. In Ontario, where French is the minority language, Francophone or bilingual institutions may have limited capacity to contribute meaningfully in the creation of Francophone OER or adopt open pedagogical practices due to their many needs, whether they are financial, political, or resource-based. Taking into consideration the Official Languages Act that underscores the mandate of the Ministry of Canadian Heritage to ensure official language minority communities can be educated in their own language, we consider that OER and OEP are an opportunity for those Francophone and bilingual institutions in minority settings to provide quality and accessible education in French. For more information about this topic, I invite you to read the report from the Francophone OER Summit that was held in the context of the OER National Strategy work that Rajiv just mentioned. We must highlight the incredible growth of open educational practices, initiatives in Ontario in the past years. We've seen growth in the context of strong alignment of OEP with common institutional goals related to equitable access, student success, and pedagogical innovation, the growing embrace of digital teaching and learning practices, and an awareness of the financial pressures faced by learners with initiatives like textbook broke campaigns. We can also highlight specific action taken by specific institutions in Ontario, such as Brock University's academic plan that includes a goal, here it's a quote, to support the creation, adaptation, and adoption of open educational resources. Whereas in their collective agreement between Brock University and the Brock University Faculty Association, there's a, here again, quote, it includes the development of open educational practices among the innovative methods of teaching that may be included as evidence to demonstrate the quality and effectiveness of teaching in application for tenure and promotion. York University and Conestoga College have created open educational working groups to develop and operationalize these strategies. Some other institution in Ontario, like Fanshawe College and the University of Ottawa, have gone further still by creating dedicated support position for open educational or open education work. Obviously, eCampus Ontario have led other initiatives such as the OER Rangers program that sponsored faculty and staff at institutions to provide peer support. And there's also a new training course, Mastering Open Education, which allow everyone to build their capacity on open education. So there's a lot going on in a lot of different institutions in the province. This momentum motivated this study, which aimed to investigate and enhance the capacity of Ontario post-secondary institutions, including public colleges, university, and Indigenous institute, to support OEP through a system-wide assessment. Over the years, open education researchers have devoted significant attention to the creation of frameworks and tools to evaluate the impact of OEP and OER. This includes, here I have the references. This include the cost, outcomes, use, and perception, the COO framework, and also in a more contemporary counterpart, the social justice, cost, outcome, perception, and engagement scope framework. However, each of these frameworks and scales that we've seen are predominantly used to assess the impact of OEP among students and or educators. However, a noticeable gap in this literature has been about the tools and framework that may be used to evaluate the capacity of individual institutions to support OEP. So inspired by tools, more recent tools, focusing on institutional integration of OEP, the 2021 Institutional Self-Assessment Tool, the ISAT, by Tanis Morgan and colleagues in British Columbia, used for a collaborative self-study across 5 post-secondary institutions, and the 2022 Quick Scan Open Educational Practices by a team from the Netherlands. We've developed the Institutional Self-Assessment Tool, number 2, the ISAT tool. So the tool is tailored to reflect the North American post-secondary context and assess the capacity of post-secondary institutions to support open educational practices. Our assessment tool is organized into 6 groupings or broad themes: vision and implementation, partnership, policies, incentives, and professional development, institutional support, leadership and advocacy, and culture change. Within those grouping, we have 22 dimensions that you see here on the screen. I won't go through all of them because they will be presented in the results. But these dimensions were assessed with the tool to assess across different levels of maturity that we see here. For each dimension, we provided a scale, or for each 22 dimension, we provided a scale of maturity levels that facilitated a deeper understanding of institutional capacities across various aspects. So it ranged from implementation at the institutional level in a continuous, sustainable manner to a limited or incidental execution, or ultimately no or absence of practice or support. So here, just a screen caption of what it looks in the tool for the institution who did the assessment. So you see that it was questioned, and then they had the choice of assessing their own institution through the different levels of maturity. For those interested in reviewing the ISAT, whether to complete it for their own institution or to adapt it, it is available for viewing and download in both English and French on the Inclusive Education Research Lab, but also in the Open Library of eCampus Ontario in both French and English.
Our primary objective was to investigate the capacity of Ontario post-secondary institutions to support open education practices through a system-wide assessment. To achieve this, ISAT-2 was developed, translated, and released under an open license, with invitations sent to provosts or vice president academics at all public post-secondary institutions in Ontario, and this included universities, colleges, and Indigenous institutes in both Anglophone and Francophone contexts. The data collection phase was hosted on Qualtrics, and it was conducted between February and July 2024. Participants were asked to complete the online survey, which consisted of 28 questions, 23 multiple choice and 5 open-ended. The survey allowed participants to save their responses and complete the survey across multiple sessions if necessary. And if they encountered questions they could not answer, they were encouraged to consult with relevant colleagues to provide the most accurate responses. This resulted in 21 out of the 53 invited institutions, 40%, completing the self-assessment instrument. This included 13 colleges, 6 universities, and 2 Indigenous institutes. Now let's talk about results, starting with the grouping vision and implementation, where we will see how various institutions are integrating open educational practices into their overarching educational vision. 95% of the institutions reported that their vision incorporates OEP to some extent. Among these, colleges tended to demonstrate a greater alignment with OEP compared to universities and Indigenous institutes. And when we look at the specifics of what institutions prioritize regarding their vision for OEP, student success emerged as the most significant factor, cited by 81% of the respondents. This was followed by pedagogical innovation and student savings, indicating a strong focus on enhancing both learning outcomes and financial accessibility for students. Other important aspects included educator flexibility and student retention. In this figure, we can see colleges represented by squares, universities represented by triangles, and Indigenous institutes represented by circles. And on the left side, we have the dimensions going from highly integrated level all the way down to being absent. So for institutional vision, a very small percentage of institutions said that their consideration of OEP in the institutional vision was completely absent. Moving up, 33% reported that it was in a limited, incidental, or informal fashion. Another 33% reported that their institutional vision considers how OEP supports existing learning and teaching practices. Moving up a level, 25% said that their institutional vision considered the need for changes in culture, policies, and practices that embrace OEP. A small percentage said that open educational practices were fully embraced and were being emulated by other institutions. Now let's talk about the stages of implementation across different types of institutions. When we look at the stages of vision implementation, according to the trans-theoretical model of change, we can see that Indigenous institutes were in the action stage, meaning that they were actively implementing their plans and were focused on continued progress. Colleges were in the preparation phase, demonstrating readiness to take action soon and beginning to make small steps towards implementation. Universities, on the other hand, were in the contemplation stage, where there was an intention to implement the vision, but there was some hesitation. Overall, these findings highlight the varying degrees of commitment and readiness among the institutions to adopt open educational practices. Now, moving on to vision implementation, we can see that only a small percentage did not have an action plan to implement open educational practices. Moving up, 38% of the participants reported limited, incidental, or informal vision implementation. Moving up, 24% reported that it was within specific areas of the institution, so it was limited to only specific areas, while 29% reported that it was across the institution, and a very small percentage reported that specific action plans for open educational practices were being implemented across the institution and beyond at a regional, national, and international level. Now let's look at the evaluation of impact. 90% of the institutions indicated that they were evaluating their initiatives and their impact. Specifically, only 10% said that there were no evaluations. Moving up, 30% reported limited, incidental, or informal evaluations of OEP impact. Moving up, 40%, the majority, reported that there were formal evaluations of OEP, but it was in a localized fashion. Moving up, 20% reported formal evaluations at the institutional level across the institution, and none of the institutions reported that their evaluations included multiple dimensions of OEP. So that could look like impact on students, educators, and the institution. In terms of partnerships, 80% of institutions reported that they were engaging in student partnerships to support OEP. Most of these partnerships were co-creation partnerships on specific projects and co-creation of open educational resources. This was followed by involvement in assessment and feedback, student surveys, and collaboration with student government. And when we compare between the institutions, colleges reported more sophisticated partnerships with students compared to universities and Indigenous institutes. So again, looking at student partnerships, 20% reported an absence of student partnerships, 35% reported limited, incidental, or informal student partnerships, 15% reported that they were localized within specific areas of the institution. Moving up, 20% reported that they were student partnerships were embraced across the institution, and a small percentage reported that student partnerships were not only embraced across the institution, but it was also structurally integrated and supported. In terms of internal partnerships, 95% of the institutions reported at least one internal partnership to support OEP. Most common partnerships were with the Center for Teaching and Learning, and this was followed by the library. Other partnerships included the campus store, Office of Registrar, academic or curriculum needs, and institutional quality assurance. For internal partnerships, specifically with the Center for Teaching and Learning, 17% reported limited, incidental, or informal partnerships. Another 17% reported partnerships that were limited to just one-off projects. 22% reported partnerships that were limited to specific areas of the institution or limited term partnerships, while majority of the institutions, 44%, reported that their internal partnerships with the Center for Teaching and Learning were ongoing, sustainable, and it reflected a long-term commitment. And colleges reported more sophisticated partnerships with Center for Teaching and Learning than the universities. Now looking at the library, 18% reported having limited, incidental, or informal partnerships with their library. 24% reported library partnerships that were limited to just one-off projects. Moving up, 5% reported limited partnerships, and a majority of the institutions, about 53%, reported partnerships with their library that was ongoing and sustainable. And looking at median responses, colleges reported stronger internal partnerships with their library than universities. Now let's look at external partnerships. Again, 95%, a high majority of the institutions reported engaging in external partnerships aimed at enhancing OEP initiatives. The most commonly referenced external partnerships was with eCampus Ontario, noted by 52% of the institutions, and partnerships with other post-secondary institutions and organizations that support open educational practices were also significant. Specific organizations mentioned included BC Campus, the Open Education Network, and Open Education Global. Other partnerships included those with Indigenous partners, industry partners, educational technology vendors, community partners for specific OER projects, and accreditation bodies. In terms of partnership trends, both colleges and universities identified eCampus Ontario as their primary external partner, and Indigenous institutes highlighted their partnerships with Indigenous partners and educational technology vendors. In this figure for external partnerships, we can see that only 5% reported not having external partners at all. Moving up, about 29% reported limited, incidental, or informal external partnerships. Moving up, a majority reported having external partnerships that were limited to just one-off projects. Moving up, 19% reported limited term external partnerships, while a small percentage reported ongoing and sustainable external partnerships.
For the policy dimension, we can see that half of the responding institutions do not have any policies in place for OEP. Out of the other half, 35% noting having limited, informal, or underdevelopment policies, 10% of the institution noting having OEP supportive policies developed and implemented across the institution, and 5%, one university, reporting an alignment of their institutional vision and policies with procedures and practices that support OEP. The policies are related to, for example, that was noted from the institution, curriculum development, teaching and learning, learning evaluation, tenure and promotion criteria, library support, and applying Creative Commons licenses to open work. When looking at the median responses for this dimension, university reported more progress than with institutional policies than did colleges. In terms of incentives, 40% reporting having limited, incidental, or informal incentives or rewards for engaging with OEP work. 25% reporting incentives or rewards at the institutional level, and 5%, again, one institution reporting incentive and reward for engaging with OEP at a institutional, regional, national, or even international level. The incentives and rewards highlighted takes the form of informal recognition, reduction of teaching load, grants, recognition during tenure and promotion, monetary incentives such as stipends, community showcases and knowledge sharing, flexible and or adjusted work hours to work with on OEP project, separate curriculum development contracts. Notably, 62% of responding colleges listed a reduction of teaching load as an incentive, while none of the 6 universities did so. There was no differences between college and university in the extent of incentive or rewards to support OEP. For professional development, 15% noted no professional development available, and another 15% noted limited support. This could take the shape of educators who use their own personal development funds to do their own professional development. 40% is of the institution mentioned offering professional development on OEP across the institution. And when we look at the median responses, colleges reported providing significantly more professional development than universities. All but one institution, 5%, reporting having some technological or other infrastructure to support OEP, which makes this dimension a strong one. 43% of the responding institution reported that basic infrastructure to support OEP were available across the institution, for example, technologies and systems to support integration of OER in the learning environment, and 24% of institutions reporting that robust infrastructure to support OEP was available across the institution, for example, technologies and systems to support OER publishing. Looking at median responses, there was no difference between colleges and university in the infrastructure provided to support OEP. However, both of these types of institutions reported providing more technology and other infrastructure than did Indigenous institutes. Regarding resources and funding, 11% of the institution declared the absence of funding and 37% reporting limited incidental or informal resources and funding to support OEP. For example, there have been individual faculty members that were taking funding from their existing professional development funding or account. 26% of the institution reporting that basic resources were available, and 11% reporting that robust resources and funding to support OEP was available across the institution. The most common type of resources and funding took the form of support for designing and implementing open pedagogy via the Center for Teaching and Learning, support for discovering OER, access to platform to technologies or platforms to support OEP, and technical assistance to use these platforms, professional development, whether provided externally or internally, support for hosting and showcasing OER. While colleges were far more likely than university to provide support for professional development, for example, support for taking courses, training, and having more dedicated positions. When we look at the median responses from all institutions, there was no differences between colleges and universities in the level of funding or other resources provided to support OEP. Research support was also examined. 21% reporting having no type of research support for OEP work, while 42% noting limited support for research on OEP, wherein most of the support was administrative in nature, such as preparation of research agreement or contract or review and submission of funding proposal. 11% reported support for the preparation of research proposal, for example, working on a budget, undertaking literature review, consulting research designs and methods, consulting for research design and methods, and providing feedback, in addition to the administrative work. And another 11% of the participating institution reported support for research and development of OEP at all stages of the research cycle. Finally, in terms of communication support, all but 10% of the institution reporting having communication channels to support OEP, 24% reporting that formal communication channel, for example, periodic meetings, email distribution lists, newsletters, webpage. So 24% reporting have those communication channels used for support of OEP within specific areas of the institution, for example, in a faculty or department. 38% reporting that formal communication channels were used to support OEP across the institution, and 5%, one institution reported that communication channels were used across the institution and also beyond. So it could be regional, national, and international networks and association channel. Looking at the median responses, universities reported somewhat more sophisticated communication channels than did colleges or Indigenous institutes.
All right, moving to grouping 5 and looking at leadership structure specifically, all responding institutions reported having at least some leadership structure to support OEP. Specifically, 50% reported limited, incidental, or informal structures such as faculty champions or communities of practice. 30% reported that one or more dedicated positions had been created to support OEP, typically within units such as the Center for Teaching and Learning or the library. 10% reported that a specialized center leads and supports OEP, and another 10% reported that a senior leader in the institutional structure leads the OEP initiative with the support of that specialized center. Looking at median responses, universities reported a more formalized leadership structure to support OEP than did colleges. Now, most commonly, institutional advocates for OEP were identified as librarians. No surprise to those of us working in this space. Support staff also from the Center for Teaching and Learning, as well as administrators, but in many cases also included faculty members. Less common were reports of student advocates, advocates from multiple internal groups, such as a cross-functional open education working group or external advocates. But colleges reported having more advocates on average who were administrators and faculty members than did universities. Looking at the adequacy of provided resources, about 80% of responding institutions reported institutional resources, whether we're talking about human, financial, or capital resources that are provided by the institution to support OEP that are more than absent or minimal. Specifically, 60% reported providing limited resources, so things like pilot funding, limited term commitments. These are commitments that are insufficient to support institution-wide uptake. 5% reported providing adequate resources to support institution-wide uptake, and about 15% reported providing substantial resources to support institution-wide uptake. Once again, looking at median responses, there was no difference between colleges and universities in the degree of institutional resourcing to support OEP. Then looking at the final grouping of culture change. Looking at awareness specifically, about 90% of responding institutions reported that institutional awareness of OEP exceeded little to no awareness. About 25% reported that awareness was limited to individual champions. 35% noted it was limited to specific areas of the institution, like certain departments, for example. 15% reported moderate awareness across the institution, and another 15% reported widespread awareness across the institution. Median responses showed really no difference in the degree of awareness by colleges and universities. Looking at the utilization of provided resources, nearly 2/3 of responding institutions reported that the utilization of available resources to support OEP exceeded little to no uptake. About 40% reported that there was sufficient uptake to justify the provision of ongoing support, and 16% reported that there was significant uptake that demonstrated a strong return on investment. But no institution reported that the demand for resources was stronger than could be sustained. Looking at median responses, colleges reported somewhat greater utilization of available resources than did universities. Looking at curriculum integration, about 95% reported some integration into courses and programs. Nearly 2/3 of them, 63%, said that whereas individual educators were experimenting with OEP in their courses, this was not yet integrated at the program level. About 26% reported that a large number of educators had integrated OEP into their courses, but yet not at a programmatic level. And 5% reported that OEP is integrated into a large number of courses, and in some cases also at the programmatic level. Looking at median responses, there was no difference between colleges and universities on this dimension. Now, moving to some of the more qualitative data, we looked at perceptions of change, and of course, of the 17 institutions that provided open-ended reflections on perceived changes towards the use of OEP in support of teaching and learning, only one reported perceiving no change in teaching culture or practice. And among the major themes that emerged among indicators of change include things like this: the growth in the number of faculty champions. Look at this representative comment. Faculty are requesting grants to co-create resources with their students. Many are interested in trying new forms of assessment because their traditional assessments are lacking in light of generative AI. There were also several mentions of things like leadership from the Center for Teaching and Learning, as well as integration into broader institutional strategy. Other themes here included things like integration into development or the quality assurance of curriculum, increases in resourcing, the use of active use of communication channels, encouragement from administrators, and upskilling of staff in this space. When it came to the perception of barriers to change, there were several themes once again, and this included, for example, the inadequate funding or other resources. As this comment reads, many faculty members are willing to explore the impact of OER and OEP. However, we are still limited by insufficient resources. So a fair compensation model and/or a structured development program are needed. It was highlighting of inadequate time to develop or integrate OER. For example, there is a desire to adopt OER or OEP, but a lack of funds or faculty loading time for this prevents uptake. And there was also many references to commercial resources and publisher or vendor practices. As in this comment, I would say that one of our greatest challenges, this person wrote, or this institution reported, is commercial online publisher content. For example, textbooks with integrated teaching tools. These are increasingly being taken up at a cost to students. Other themes mentioned by at least one institution included skepticism or internal resistance, concerns about quality control, the absence of technological or other expertise, and the protection of cultural knowledge. Looking across all of these dimensions now in terms of overall trends, it is clear that post-secondary institutions in Ontario are strongest when it comes to their internal partnerships with the library and with the Centre for Teaching and Learning. And given the strong reliance of OEP on software tools and platforms to support things like discoverability, publication, and sharing of OER, as well as to support student engagement with OEP, it is not a surprise that institutions also provide reasonably strong technological and other infrastructural support for OEP. There was only moderate institutional support, however, across the majority of dimensions for internal capacity, with plenty of room for further investment in funding and in other institutional resources, the development of external partnerships, professional development opportunities, the use of communication channels, the evaluation of impact. And these modest levels of institutional support really reflect, I think, the lukewarm embrace of OEP within institutional visions, as well as in the moderate levels of institutional awareness of OEP and utilization of provided resources. Most institutions lacked a formalized structure or specialized center to lead OEP initiatives and had relatively weak student partnerships. Other dimensions that revealed significant room for improvement include institutional incentives or rewards to support OEP, research support for OEP, and the integration of OEP into the curriculum. And finally, the dimension that showed the weakest support for OEP was institutional policy. Looking at differences across types of institutions, it's clear that Ontario's colleges have developed a greater capacity to support OEP than the universities. For example, responding colleges reported greater integration with institutional visions, greater implementation of action plans, more sophisticated partnerships. Colleges also support more professional development, more likely to have dedicated staff positions, have greater uptake of available resources, and have more advocates who are administrators and faculty. Conversely, there were only 4 dimensions along which responding universities demonstrated greater maturity with OEP supports, and these were institutional policies, open access scholarship, communication channels, and formalized leadership structure. Moving to our recommendations, we have 10 of these. And so I'll start with strategize. We recommend integrating an explicit reference to OEP within the institutional strategic plan or academic plan and developing an implementation plan for these strategic goals that outlines ambitious yet achievable operational goals, ensuring that metrics or milestones that are relevant are aligned so that progress may be tracked. Lead, specifically by creating a cross-functional open education working group and even designating a senior academic leader to coordinate or liaise with this group. Partner, deepen internal partnerships in support of OEP, particularly with areas such as the Library and Centre for Teaching and Learning, and develop new partnerships with areas such as the Campus Store or Office of the Registrar. Develop a partnership with the Undergraduate Student Association. Externally, leverage the resources that eCampus Ontario provides to the sector, and looking further afield, consider joining groups or organizations such as Canada OER, the Open Education Network, or Open Education Global. Encourage. Identify and align appropriate incentive structures for OEP, whether formal in terms of time releases or grants, or informal. Consider revisions to policies in areas such as intellectual property, curriculum development, or tenure and promotion, so that these explicitly permit or encourage, but do not mandate, the embrace of OEP. Raise awareness of OEP and provide regular professional development opportunities for educators. Staff. Invest in the creation of one or more dedicated positions, such as OER librarians, and support appropriate professional development for these roles. Fund. Support a limited number of curricular integrations of OER each year, potentially targeting program areas that enjoy an abundance of high-quality OER and that also enjoy high student enrollment. incentivize educators to review relevant OER, and go on to create an OER adoption grant program that recognizes the labor involved in shifting to OER. Integrate. Embed support for OEP within major institutional platforms and technologies. This may include the library catalog, the learning management system, the student information system, and the course timetable, and the campus store's course materials reporting platform. Communicate. Use existing channels to share resources, opportunities, and other updates related to OEP with educators, and work with the Student Association to communicate with students around initiatives related to the affordability of course materials. Research. Support the scholarship of teaching and learning on open educational practices through existing training and funding, as well as by promoting relevant external opportunities and fellowships, of which there are many. Collaborate across the sector, including on professional development and OER creation projects. Openly license training and promotional materials and other resources, such as LibGuides, to permit their wider use and adaptation. And as a bonus 11th recommendation, if your institution did not participate in this study, please consider using the ISET2 to self-assess your institution's capacity and maturity. And of course, do share your results with our research team as well. To wrap up, I just want to point to next steps. As Robert mentioned at the start, we're really looking forward to the release of the formal report next week at TESS 2024 on November 5th. And in the weeks to follow, we will be working on the customized reports that will be delivered to every single participating institution to provide them with individualized guidance for their specific context. And finally, we're certainly looking forward to continuing to build on this work, including through a similar study that's now planned with our colleagues in British Columbia at BC campus as well. But for now, of course, this brings us to the end of our presentation, and we really look forward to using the remaining time of this webinar to hear from you. So we invite your questions, your comments, and with that, I'll hand things back to you, Robert. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rajiv, Moya, and Catherine. Merci beaucoup. That was an excellent review of the results. As I said at the outset, I'm super excited by these results, and I really love how the recommendations have been framed. I think Clint put a comment in, hi Clint, about excellent recommendations, very tangible action items. We do have a question in the Q&A feature, and I'll just say to folks, feel free to type a question in. I don't know if people can use sound. Can people do that in this format, or is it only text? Well, that question.
You can unmute someone if they go to react. They can raise their hand, and then you can unmute them.
Okay, there, we've got the power. That's fantastic. But there is a question to start with in the Q&A feature, which you can also use at the bottom, which is from an anonymous attendee. Why do you think colleges have OEP more integrated into their planning as opposed to universities?
Yeah, it's a terrific question. And I certainly invite my colleagues to augment what I'll kick off with. But I think it's a really interesting trend. I suspect it reflects a few things. I mean, of course, formally, people are telling us it reflects things like the integration of OEP in their institutional visions, the extent to which they're tangibly resourcing it. But again, why is all of that happening? I think part of this is a lot of the early work in this space was focused intensely on OER, even before it really expanded into open pedagogy. Colleges have tended to historically be much more access-oriented as institutions. That's one, of course, driving force over here. I think another piece is that right from the BC Open Textbook Project on forward, whether it's philanthropic organizations or governments or individual institutions, people have typically wanted to focus their investments in the development of high quality OER in areas that show the greatest return on philanthropic investment or government investment. And so this is why if you look at first and second year courses, large scale survey courses, this is where we have the most abundant wealth of OER that is high quality. So I think there's a few factors, but for me, the access orientation of colleges is certainly one. The availability of high quality OER that clusters around those first 2 years is another. But if I may also share another observation from some of our earlier work in British Columbia, and I know Clint Lalonde is in the webinar as well. And Clint, please feel free to jump in with your thoughts in the chat as well. One of the trends we have seen in BC, at least, is over the years a greater tendency, a greater openness to adopting OER that's created elsewhere by colleges, and a lesser interest in adopting OER created at other institutions by universities. Now that has changed, but typically universities have been really interested in adopting what they create at their institution. But of course, there's a degree of elitism within our sector that I don't think is a secret at all. And over time, I think as people have understood how high quality the OER can be, whether it's produced at a college or whether it's produced by an individual educator without even official institutional support, that has abated somewhat. But for me, I think it starts with the access focus and the sensitivity to things like equity in the context of that access to education. So I'll just pause if Catherine or Oya want to add to anything I just said.
No, this is a great response. I think also for the university context, we know that academic freedom is a huge thing. So, if there's no incentives also to create OER and participate in OEP, that may be why faculty members do not engage. But also the whole discussion about promotion and tenure is also, I think, we must highlight that. So I mentioned earlier in the session that Brock University now has OER in there as part of, it can be highlighted in the promotion dossier, but it's not at all the case at most institutions. So I think some faculty members might want to engage in more like research focused work instead of engaging in OER and OEP work. So that might be one reason too that we see that universities are kind of dragging behind it.
That's a great observation. Oh, sorry, Rajiv, did you?
Yeah, no. I think Catherine made exactly the right point over there. And I also noting Christina Hendricks is in the webinar, which is wonderful. She's a real leader in the space from UBC. It reminds me as well that even in BC, when the Student Association at UBC actually successfully advocated to integrate OER into the tenure and promotion guidelines under educational leadership, that certainly was a big difference. So I think Catherine's absolutely right. The tenure and promotion policy is a really important one, particularly if you're talking about early career faculty and aligning those kinds of incentives where maybe that's not as important in other contexts. Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to say, I mean, I spent 9 years of my career of the last 30 or so in the college environment here in Ontario. And my experience is that the colleges, more than the universities, maybe then, maybe less now, are more likely to share experiences, content, et cetera. So their models are a little bit different. But I think the differentiation between research and teaching is probably one of the more profound indicators there. We have a question from Shauna Roach, and I just want to point out that Shauna from Fanshawe College presented, I think it was last year or maybe the year before, Shauna, the OER Design Studio model at Fanshawe College. And I think this is really important. Shauna has a question, which I'll get to, I promise. But there are models here. Rajiv, you just mentioned the UBC model. Brock University is leading the way with having the student unions co-invest with the institution in funding the development of OER. The model that Shauna pioneered with the OER Design Studio, which pairs up librarians, which, let's face it, are the best advocates for OER ever, pairs up librarians with faculty and students to get work integrated learning to develop OER, showing massive success, $3 million in savings at Fanshawe annually alone. So I think that's very significant. And I think one of the things that resonated with me with this discussion is that OER are free, but they're not free to create or free to use. And we need to be able to label the unpaid labor and find ways to remunerate for that, because we can't expect people just to do something for nothing necessarily. But on the, Rajiv, you mentioned the philanthropic return on investment, I think is really important, as is the student experience. And one of the things that I was struck by the results of the study and your earlier work was that it is the access agenda that OER are helping the most. And I think that that's a very significant thing that we don't want to get away from. But I promise to answer Shauna's question, which is, will the institutions that participated be listed in the report? And I think I know the answer, but I'll ask you to answer that directly.
Yes, no, thank you for asking the question. So at the end of the report, we do provide a list of all of the public post-secondary institutions that were invited to participate. We are not listing the ones that specifically participated. As with research over here, we certainly wanted to make sure we are providing that feedback to individual members. But no, we're not flagging the subsection. But this is a situation of you know who you are. So if you're interested in using the instrument and certainly following up, we would love to work with you to partner. But of course, the tool is also available for you to use by yourself as well.
Fantastic. And thank you, Shauna. And thank you, Shauna, for your leadership. Some great comments in the chat here as well about college OERs by college librarians working collectively. I would be remiss if I didn't mention our librarian team, Mary Gu, Siri Gauthier, and Sarah Supnanan, who are doing amazing work at supporting the sector, working with the libraries here in Ontario. I think without Mary and Siri and Sarah, I don't think we would be as far. I know we wouldn't be as far along as we are, and I always enjoy engaging with them and learning from them. Clint has an observation that we have found that brokering partnerships, especially in OER creation projects between colleges and universities, can help with reducing that sense of elitism. Having people from both working on collaborative projects can help break down those perceived barriers. And I think that that's a great point, Clint. Certainly, the virtual learning strategy, $70 million of support for the sector, half of which went to OER, all of which featured collaborations among colleges, universities, and Indigenous institutes. We have another question here. In your research, do you see any copyright-related challenges or barriers encountered by potential users? If so, how are these challenges handled by the potential users? And what would you suggest with respect to copyright-related issues in OER?
Yeah, it's a good question. Catherine, I wonder if you feel like leading this one off. But and I will note that the survey itself focused on institutional responses, not individual educators who might be more caught up with questions like this. But I mean, typically, I would say generally with support for discoverability of OER, typically through the library, although sometimes also in partnership with the Center for Teaching and Learning, there is support for understanding what is OER, what is not OER. If we're talking about OER, which Creative Commons license are we talking about? And if you're talking about going further and adopting and maybe adapting or remixing OER, how you can actually make that work in a technical sense. But Catherine, do you have any thoughts to add to that?
Yes, well, briefly, like you mentioned, this was answered by provo and vice provo that might not be aware of all what's going on at the individual level when we are in OEP. So we haven't seen any highlights of that in the responses, in the open-ended also responses, but it's obviously part of the conversation. Also, when you're working with students, knowing about their their copyrights when they are providing work for the creation of OER. This is absolutely essential to know about your copyright and how open licenses work. But again, this was more institutional level, so it was not specifically kind of addressed.
Yeah, and maybe if I'll just quickly add to that as well, Catherine, you made me think of two other things, which is increasingly I'm seeing areas, departments like Centers for Teaching and Learning as just a normative practice using open licensing to share their resources, to share their whether it's specific guides, whether it's certain videos or other things, infographics. So that's a practice that is helping normalize that the embrace of open licensing among educators. But I think you're right in highlighting the IP of student work. Certainly at Brock and even at my former institution in British Columbia, at both institutions, students own the IP for their coursework. And so one of the things that has been developed along the way, it's a wheel that nobody needs to recreate. In Ontario, certainly, is there are readily available and adaptable explainers to students, so that if you're an educator working with students in an open pedagogy context, it is their choice. They have the agency. So they need to understand what open licensing is. And if they choose to apply an open license to their public scholarship, if that's an option in your open pedagogical project, they need to decide what specific open license they want to apply. So those kinds of templates and agreements and guides exist. There's good support even from a group called the Rebus Foundation with a guide to students creating OER. So certainly it's an interesting topic, but I think between your university library or copyright officer or Center for Teaching and Learning, you're likely to get the right answer.
Amazing. We're 1 minute from 3 o'clock. Want to respect everybody's time. Oya and Catherine and Rajiv, thank you so much for coming and sharing your expertise with the group today. Obviously, we probably could have had a discussion for a long time, but fear not. You can come to TESS next week and continue this most amazing and engaging discussion. Lithia has helpfully put in the link to TESS November 5th and 6th for next week. You can still get tickets up until 5 today. And if it's not enough just to know that you can come and see Rajiv and Catherine and Oya, I will tell you that it is our 10th anniversary and we will have cake and a time machine. So I'm going to leave it at that. And I guess on the interest of time machine, I'm going to say that open education is the future. It's the future of education as we notice, the future of affordable education. It's the future of accessible education. And we are all going to collectively look back on this moment right now when we witness the future being unfolded here in Ontario. So please join me in thanking Rajiv, Oya, and Catherine for your time. And I hope to see you all in the sessions at TESS next week. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Robert. Thank you, everyone.